Hey there, happy Friday and welcome back to the farm. So, I'm an organic farmer, you're an organic farmer, or at the very least, you're interested in learning about organic farming. Now, it's important to remember that 90% of the time, organic farming is basically the same as chemically enhanced farming. All the processes are going to be done in much the same way. There are three things that are significantly changed, however. First is insect prevention, as obviously most insecticides are chemical. Second is pH balancing, because a lot of pH balancing agents are also chemical. But the most important, and the one that I want to talk about today, is nutrient enhancement or fertilizing of your soil. So, mostly we're going to be talking about compost, how to make it, how to use it properly, how to make sure it's good. But before we get into that, I want to show you a couple of other alternatives that you have in case you don't have time or cannot make enough compost to maintain your entire operation. So, just so we're on the same page, typically when you're looking at fertilizer, you're going to see three numbers that are mentioned there. And those are your big three triangle of nutrients that you need to concern yourself with in plants. They are potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Now, there are other things, and if they're relevant here, I might mention them, but typically if you can balance those three things correctly for your plant, you're going to have a good result in your crop. So the first thing I want to talk about is bone meal. And bone meal is exactly what it sounds like. It is the dried and ground up bones of animals. It is a really, really good source of phosphorus, not much of a source of anything else. That being said, phosphorus is, in my experience, the most common element to get out of whack or get too low in your soil. Now, unless you're a butcher or you are butchering your own livestock, you are not going to produce enough bones to make bone meal sufficient for the needs of even a small plot of land. So you're going to have to buy it. The good news is that it's pretty darn cheap, and there's really no reason not to stock up on it. Next, I want to talk about worm castings. And worm castings are exactly what they sound like. They are the castings out of the backside of a worm as it kind of passes through the soil. Now, unless you have a worm farm, which is, by the way, an outstandingly lucrative business, unless you have a worm farm, you're going to have to buy this stuff. And the downside to this stuff is it is super expensive. The good part about it is that it is high in all three of the major nutrient groups, as well as magnesium, calcium, and plenty of other things. This stuff is some of the best stuff, organically speaking, that you can put in your soil, and that's why it's so expensive. Now, unable to join us tonight are our last two exhibits. Number one being wood ash. And wood ash is, again, exactly what it sounds like. It's the ash from wood. You can collect it from a fireplace. You can collect it from a burn pit. The key here is you're going to want to use a fire that was set specifically to make fertilizer. And the reason is you don't want any chance of there being any plastics or chemical accelerants that are left over in the ash, which by getting into the soil could potentially hurt your plants. And wood ash is an excellent source of potassium. That's the main thing that you're going to get out of it. Last but certainly not least is manure. Now, an important disclaimer here. Do not ever use the manure of cats, dogs, or human beings, or any other animal that is carnivorous or omnivorous. It is way too easy for them to pass on parasites and diseases. It is a major public safety risk. Do not do it. The two most common and best animals to use for their manure are chickens and cows. Now, chickens are great because a lot of you probably already have your own chickens. If you are, farming organically or home gardening, you probably have your own chickens already. Chickens are little fertilizer making machines. You can feed them all of your kitchen waste and they will turn it into fertilizer for you. The downside to chickens is that they don't produce a whole lot of waste as things go. and you would need a ton of chickens even to produce enough manure to fertilize like a small 1 acre operation. The other animal is cows, and cows are pretty much the opposite. Not a lot of people are going to have access to cows. I'm incredibly fortunate that we have cows and I can just go pick up their manure. Cows, however, take up a lot of space, and a lot of people don't have enough room for them. So, if you can find a farmer who will let you go out and collect his cow patties and stuff, that is a great idea. You should absolutely do it. If not, you're probably going to just have to miss out on that one. If you do use cow manure, it is important to note that you do need to give it a couple weeks to sit aside and dry out and ferment first. Do not throw fresh, wet cow manure into the soil with your plants. It will burn your roots, and that's just an important thing to know because you don't want that to happen. So that's all of the little specific organic fertilizers I want to talk about before we get into compost. And I do want to make it clear here, I'm talking about compost from the perspective of an organic farmer because that's me, that's my perspective. But compost is a great thing regardless if you're an organic farmer or not. If you're a chemically enhanced farmer, by which I mean a farmer who uses chemicals to enhance his plants and not a farmer who uses steroids, if you are such a person, you can still make some compost and use it to replace some of your chemical fertilizer and save yourself some money. If you don't farm at all, you can still compost. It's still great for the environment. You can throw it on your lawn and help your lawn out. Or if you can find somebody who will put the compost to use, you might be able to barter yourself some free vegetables or maybe even sell it. So let's go ahead and take a look at compost. Okay, so this is a miniaturized composting operation. This is a good size for somebody who's just starting out home composting. Basically what we have here is a small pot, and we're going to start throwing in kitchen waste, plant matter, or even weeds that you pull, as long as you remove the seeds and stuff. And then once we got a nice layer of that, we're gonna cover it over with a layer of dirt. In this case, it's kind of mud, and I'll touch on why that is in a second. And once you have that covered on the top, we're gonna go grab ourselves a hose. And we just wanna slightly dampen the inside of this. You do not wanna put enough water in there that it's going to start flowing through the bottom. The reason being, that's gonna start taking the nutrients out of it. And we're actually gonna talk about that in a second when we talk about compost tea. Then you're just gonna wanna cover it up, and you're gonna wanna keep doing that. Every time you have a nice load of compost to put in there, go ahead and put it in, cover it up, dampen it, cover it. Once that thing gets full, let it sit for about a month, stirring it about once a week. And once it's had time, we're gonna come over here to our large compost bucket and just dump it in. Now this is all prepared, ready to go compost, right? This is super rich. Of course, you can mix this in with your soil and create a more fertile soil. You can also use it to make compost tea and use that like you would use a traditional fertilizer. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So, say we want to use our compost to fertilize plants that are already in the ground. How do we do that? Well, we come over here to our big compost bucket. I want to note, the reason I cover these is so when it rains, there's not water pouring through them, because that will take the nutrients out of it and kind of defeat the whole purpose. So we're going to come over here to our compost. We're going to get ourselves a little pot, and we're going to go ahead and fill it with compost. Now this is a regular potting pot. It's got holes in the bottom, and that's important for our purposes. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to place it into a small metal bucket. This one without holes in the bottom, also important for our purposes. Now we're going to slowly run some water through this. Go ahead and let it seep through. And what we're doing is we're letting that water pick up all the nutrients from in the compost on its way through. Once the water's in the bucket, we can take this and we can let it steep in there for a little while. We're just letting, again, all of those nutrients get into the water. And once they've had, I usually let it steep for about a night. I'll put it in the evening and let it steep overnight. And once we're done, we're left with two byproducts. We now have our old compost, which has been leached of a lot of its nutrients, and we now have this water, which is called compost tea. Now, what do you do with compost tea? Well, like I said, you can use it as a fertilizer. I'm going to take some here and pour it into a small bucket. And then we'll walk down here to one of the larger loquat trees. And you're just going to pour it into the soil, not onto the plant. That's an important thing to know anytime you're fertilizing anything. You're not fertilizing the plant, you're fertilizing the soil, which the plant will eat from. Now, if you're doing this onto like cabbage or something where you're getting it onto soft leaves that you might nitrogen burn, it's important to go ahead and water it afterward. This big tree here is going to be fine. And we've now just added fertility, we've added nutrients into the soil, just like if we had used a chemical fertilizer. Now, even this old leached compost has a use. It's basically dirt now with maybe a little bit of extra nutrients in it. And what I use it for is as the dirt that I use to cover each layer of compost in my compost bin. That way you're not throwing even the tiny little bits of nutrients that may be left over away. You're keeping everything in the system. Now, compost tea, I think, is the most useful way to use compost. You can, however, also mix it in with soil. I find a 50-50 mix works pretty well, and you can use that as your planting soil, as an alternative to like a potting or gardening soil from Miracle-Gro that comes with chemicals in it. I think it's just as good as that, if not better, and it's 100% organic. These are the two main ways that I use compost. Another thing you can do is take it to a fallow field and spread it on the top and let it leach nutrients into the soil and replenish the soil. And that's a pretty good use for it, but I think that unless you're talking about a large piece of property, let's say like 3 acres and up, you're probably better off just going ahead and using the compost tea. So that's all I had to say to you guys today. I hope that I helped you out with all of your composting and organic fertilizing needs. Hopefully you learned something. Any other questions, leave them in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next week on Farm Fridays or Sundays and Tuesdays on my other series. And peace.